Hello, everyone. I'm Fred Kemp, President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. And it's a particular pleasure to be with you today with our audience in the headquarters, audience online around the world, and virtually. We gather this afternoon for a special occasion to celebrate the launch of a new book, Handoff: The Foreign Policy George W. Bush Passed to Barack Obama, edited by Steve Hadley and co-edited by Peter Feaver, Will Inboden, and Megan O'Sullivan. Handoff first hit the shelves on February 15th and has topping charts ever since. Part of the reason I know that is in the week that it hit the shelves, it went off the shelves at Politics and Prose, and I didn't get my copy until just last week. Let me just read you two comments on the back, and I hope it will influence you and the audience here at our headquarters to buy a copy afterwards and join us at the reception. You who are online, go to your favorite shop and buy several copies. If I'm not mistaken, all of this is contributed to charity. So the earnings from the book, and it's selling extremely well thus far, are going to charity. So you're not only buying a terrific book, but you're also helping good causes. Bob Woodward on the back, on the flyleaf, writes, "This is a brilliant, powerful book of transparency with serious people writing about declassified, top secret, and secret transition memos that many of them had a hand in writing." John Meacham, a presidential historian who I respect a great deal, writes, "Headlines and spin come and go, but history and substance endure, a great truth amply illustrated by this landmark book." Further, he calls it an essential contribution to the literature, not only of the American presidency, but of democracy itself. It's currently the #1 new release in international diplomacy on Amazon. So, Steve, it's wonderful to have you here to share the book with us. As many of you know, and I see several board members in the audience, and thank you for being here, and I know many are also registered online. So thank you for your support, and thank you to be here for this event. Steve is the Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council's board. He's chairman of our International Advisory Board, and he served as National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush from 2005 to 2009. If I listed all the other jobs he's had in government, it would take too long, so I won't do that. But he knows his stuff. He's been a tremendous partner for the Council, and he's been a friend and an inspiration to me. His keen intellect, his generosity of spirit, his strategic mind, and his uniquely sound judgment all add up to a really quite special individual and public servant. He's remarkably generous with his time at the Atlantic Council, chairing our Strategy and Programs Committee and providing both the advisory guidance, both advisory guidance and substantive collaboration with the Scowcroft Center, with our China Global Hub, with our Mideast Center, and across the Atlantic Council. So we're really lucky for everything you do for us, Steve. I would also like to salute everyone in the audience, everyone online. And finally, I'd like to welcome our moderator, Vivian Salama from the Wall Street Journal. Those of you know me, I have a soft spot for the Wall Street Journal, my alma mater. And she's been working on national security and foreign policy issues for nearly 2 decades with reporting stops in more than 80 countries. And she's just fresh back from Secretary Blinken's trip, including the final stop in India. Today, we're looking forward to what will be a wide-ranging, candid discussion about the Bush administration's foreign policy transition to the Obama administration and its legacy 14 years after. Presidential transitions and peaceful transfer of power are sacred in American democracy, but it doesn't happen by accident. Our mission at the Atlantic Council is shaping the global future together along partners and allies. Without successful transitions, you can't have that kind of relationships with partners and allies because you're losing the continuity and the reliability for those sorts of relationships. George W. Bush's national security team, led by Steve, set a gold standard in this respect. With remarkable collegiality, they worked to prepare the incoming Obama White House, including through a series of dozens of transition memos to take the reins of complex moment in history marked by ongoing crises in the global economy and the Middle East. Updated and annotated to include modern reflections, these now declassified memos featured in the book provide a glimpse into how senior Bush administration officials viewed their foreign policy decisions at the time and assessed their implications today. Today's conversation will last approximately 45 minutes, followed by an audience Q&A, where audience members can submit questions via Zoom, or for those in person on an iPad that will be circulated by our Atlantic Council staff. Or if you catch Vivian's eye, she may call on you as well. After the discussion, we invite you to join us for the reception, where we'll have copies of Handoff available for purchase from Politics and Prose, where I couldn't get it earlier. And Steve has generously agreed to sign your copies. And with that, let me turn the floor to Vivian.
Thanks so much, Fred. Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. It's always great to be at the Atlantic Council, and especially with Stephen Hadley, someone with profound experience in the national security world, which is something I cover very closely. I'm sorry to say I did get a copy of the book very early so that I could check it out. I cheated a little and got a virtual copy while I was traveling. And it really is a phenomenal look, not just at national security policy over the last 2 decades, but also about presidential transitions. And, you know, you call it handoff. And just, I hope this is not too much of a spoiler, but it's a collection of your writings, the writings of a number of very skilled national security officials, including many Bush 43 alum, and then cables, transition cables, or the memos that you passed along to the incoming Obama administration. And so I wanted to ask you, you know, dare I say the most recent presidential transition, was that an inspiration for you to write this book, or is this something that you've been toying with now for some time?
It's something we've been toying with for some time. My recollection of these memos was that they were pretty good. They were designed to help the new team prepare themselves to take on the responsibility so they would be ready to go from day one and have the background on the various issues. But about 3 years ago, it occurred to me that they were also a pretty good legacy for how the Bush administration approached foreign policy. And the thought was that if we could declassify these, then update them to show what has happened since, it would give us a platform to do two things. One, try to evaluate how the Bush administration did. What did we get right? What did we get wrong? And then secondly, looking back at how 4 administrations of different parties over 20 years had dealt with these issues. There were probably lessons learned that were still relevant going forward. And one of the things, if you look at the table of contents, the issues that are talked about in the book are still with us today. So that was the purpose of the book. It went from being basically the transition memos, went from being transition documents to, in some sense, legacy documents about what was the Bush approach on foreign policy.
I mean, I can't echo that enough. It just so happens that today the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released its annual threat assessment, and so many of the themes that I was reading in the report today were in your book as well. And so to say that, you know, there's continuity is an understatement for sure. I want to touch upon some of the various issues, the widespread issues that you have in the book, but I do want to start with Iraq because we are coming up on the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. It's hard to imagine. We also marked the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Afghanistan in recent years. The world has changed dramatically, and America has actually changed so dramatically since then. And we now have 2 administrations that have been promoting a so-called America First policy. The Biden administration doesn't necessarily use that phrase, but it's definitely adhered to some of those types of policies. And our large-scale deployments that we saw during the Bush era in the wake of 9/11 have been scaled back so significantly to you know, counterterrorism operations that focus on over-the-horizon operations, sort of at a distance, and focusing on the home front instead. And so I wanted to ask you, you know, your book focuses a lot on some of those big picture themes over the last 20 years. And so what is your biggest takeaway looking at the invasion 20 years ago and where we are today as far as the war on terrorism, counterterrorism efforts, and our own national security at home?
Well, there's a big question there, and thank you very much for doing this today. In terms of the war on terror, I think one of the things you have to think about was what did the world look like to the Bush administration after 9/11? And people forget 9/11, 19 terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes, killed over 3,000 people from over 80 countries. And the intelligence community said at that time that this was going to be the first of a wave of mass casualty attacks on the United States, some of which could involve weapons of mass destruction. And 1 month later, in October of 2001, of course, envelopes with white powder that turned out to be anthrax poison showed up at congressional offices on Capitol Hill and at media offices around the country, and we didn't know who was behind it. And the other thing that people forget is that the Director of National Intelligence puts out a report on terrorist incidents. So I looked at from 9/11 through the end of 2002. There were 38 major terrorist incidents around the world in 13 countries that killed dozens and dozens of people and injured a lot more. So the environment after 9/11 was quite sobering. And the good story for America, for its institutions, and it was done on a bipartisan basis between the executive and the Congress, was what we did to put ourselves in a position to defend, protect, and in some sense disrupt those terrorist attacks. And the good news for the American people is because of those efforts, those predictions by the intelligence community did not come true. And we have not had another mass casualty attack on the United States in the 20 years since. So in terms of the war on terror, I think it's a good story, and it's a good story for the American people, and what the government can do when Republicans and Democrats work together, and the executive and the Congress can work together.
What is your assessment on how it impacted the U.S. intelligence community in particular? I mean, this is something that comes up even today, where you hear Russian President Vladimir Putin casting doubt on U.S. intelligence in his own war against Ukraine, because he always points to the war in Iraq and the failure to find weapons of mass destruction after the invasion. Former President Donald Trump has even made those accusations against the intelligence community, which is important to say that it wasn't necessarily the intelligence community, but the assessments that were put out publicly, and not the whole intelligence picture. And so, looking back on how that has sort of unfolded over the last 20 years, what is your takeaway?
Well, one of the problems for the intelligence community is, in some sense, they only have one defender, which is the President of the United States. And there's a lot of, it's very easy to say when something goes wrong, oh, it starts with an intelligence failure. I give the intelligence community a lot of credit for helping us get the intelligence we need to disrupt and prevent those terrorist attacks, and to make sure that their own predictions did not come true. Certainly, the intelligence community is widely regarded as having made a mistake with respect to the weapons of mass destruction, and whether Saddam Hussein had them at the time we went to war in March of 2003. Turns out the intelligence at the time was wrong. I've said to folks, I think it was less an intelligence failure than a failure of imagination. Nobody came to the President of the United States, Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, and said, what if Saddam Hussein has actually gotten rid of his WMD, as all those 16 UN Security Council resolutions said he should, but doesn't want anyone to know it because he doesn't want the Iranians, with whom he's just fought a 10-year bloody war, to know that he's given up his WMD because it might make him vulnerable. And it turns out in the debriefs of Saddam Hussein, that seems to be the case. In some sense, it's a failure of imagination, and I think one of the things the intelligence community has tried to do and needs to do more of is, how do you get that kind of out-of-the-box speculation into the intelligence community so it isn't strangled in its crib and actually gets up to decision makers? I think the record of the intelligence community since has been, one, they've done a lot of reforms, and certainly the intelligence in the run-up to Russia's invasion or re-invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was quite superb, and was used very effectively to get notice to Ukraine about what was coming, to prepare our allies to join with us to support Ukraine, and to try to deter Putin from doing what he ultimately did. So I think the intelligence community sometimes is a bit of a battered child, and I think it's done a good job in fixing the problems that occurred in connection with the Iraq WMG assessments, and serving the country extremely well.
Yeah, the declassification of intelligence in the lead up to Russia was definitely something that was pretty extraordinary. And also the overclassification has been an issue that has come up in recent months, especially because of classified documents popping up in places where it shouldn't. But I wanted to ask you about Afghanistan in particular. Obviously the justification for that invasion was very different. And now, post-withdrawal, we are going into a period where the GOP-led House has vowed to conduct an investigation against the Biden administration's efforts to withdraw. And critics of the move don't necessarily criticize the fact that they want to do an investigation. It was chaotic. There were American lives lost upon the exit. But that if you're going to do a fair investigation, it needs to include everyone from the beginning of the war, and that includes the Bush 43 administration. Do you agree that the Bush administration, former Bush officials, should be included in any investigation? Would you be willing to testify if the House were to call you? And what do you tell your Republican colleagues in the House about how we are going to get a true accountability about how that war took place, went on?
Well, my understanding is that about a year ago, Congress passed legislation for a step-back look at Afghanistan. They constituted a panel in order to do that, a bipartisan panel. They basically said nobody who is associated with the Afghan decisions can serve on that panel, which is probably right. And they basically said, we're going to go all the way back to the beginning, the history of America's engagement in Afghanistan. And that's the way to do it. That is the way to do it, rather than focusing just on the last act.
There's been so much focus on, well, let's take a step back. The Bush 43 administration obviously got thrown into wars by product of the 9/11 attacks. And the presence in the Middle East and South Asia has been significant up until recent years, where we've withdrawn from Afghanistan. Our presence in Iraq is barely 2,500, and we have troops scattered in very small numbers throughout across the globe. And so I'm curious if you think this has created a vacuum now, whether or not withdrawal was the way to go, or whether or not withdrawal has created a vacuum that will allow the Iranians, the Chinese, the Russians, whoever, to step in and replace America and ultimately, kind of tip the scale in their favor.
Well, I'd be glad to talk about Iraq. You're one of the real experts on Iraq, having served as bureau chief there for AP. So I can give it to you from my perspective. Look, we went through a variety of, let's do Iraq. There's a view out there that and Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations has marketed this idea there are wars of necessity and wars of choice. Afghanistan was a war of necessity. Iraq was a war of choice. I say to people, I think Iraq was a war of last resort, that we over 12 years tried to enforce 16 UN Security Council resolutions that said to Saddam Hussein, either give up your WMD or show that you've given them up, stop supporting terror, stop invading your neighbors, and stop terrorizing your people. And we tried to enforce those, the international community, through 17 UN Security Council resolutions, through no-fly zones over the northern part and southern part of the country, dumb sanctions, smart sanctions, smarter sanctions, various inspection regimes, military strikes under the Clinton administration on Iraq. And in the end of the day, we got to the point where Saddam Hussein was not complying. And Bush tried what we called coercive diplomacy, build up our force levels, threatening the use of force in order to coerce and get Saddam Hussein to decide that he had better either comply or leave the country. And I think it's working, and I think President Bush thought it was going to work until February of 2003, when Chancellor Schroeder of Germany and President Chirac of France and Vladimir Putin of Russia all said publicly they would not support use of military force against Iraq under any circumstances. And at that point, Saddam Hussein thought he had a get-out-of-jail-free card, that that President Bush would not use force without an 18th UN Security Council resolution, and the French and the Russians would block it. That was a miscalculation. For Bush, the issue was, do I use this force that I've accumulated to enforce the writ of the United States and the international community, or do I say, we were all just kidding, bring the forces home, let Saddam Hussein get out of jail free card? And the predictions at the time were that he would, once the sanctions were lifted, he would be back in the business of supporting terror, pursuing weapons of mass destruction, terrorizing his people, and invading his neighbors. And the president decided that was a choice that he was not willing to make, and so we went to war on March of 2003.
I want to broaden things out, and obviously we could sit here talking about this alone all day, but I want to give our audience a sense of the diverse topics that you cover in the book. You talk about the proliferation problem, which is still related, but you talk a lot about North Korea, Iran, and other countries as well. And one of the interesting things you say is that there have been no nuclear weapon states since the Bush administration, and the tactic that you used at the time with allies and partners was a carrot and sticks model to try to persuade the leaders of these countries to make a strategic shift. But you also note that the effort to convince these countries to make such a strategic shift would have had no chance of success if it had not been credible. And credibility depended on being backed by a, quote, balance of power that favored freedom, that could deliver on both the threats and the promises. What did you mean by that?
You know, it's really shown by, I think, what is, I think, one of the real opportunity costs that were paid by the United States in the aftermath of the Iraq invasion. And if you think about it, in 2003, we had rather quickly toppled the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, had rather quickly toppled Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we had used force not to spread democracy out of the barrel of a gun, but to address real national security problems, part of which were the pursuit of WMD by Saddam Hussein and the Taliban. So Muammar Gaddafi in Libya looks at that and says, I may be next. So he voluntarily gives up his WMD. The Iranians think we might be next, and they voluntarily terminate, so far as intelligence later determined, their covert nuclear weapons program in 2003. We engage in diplomacy with both of them. We get in September of 2005 an agreement by North Korea to give up their nuclear programs, and the EU3, Germany, UK, and France work together and get the Iranians to agree in 2004 to give up their nuclear programs. You know, it looks like we're going to run the table on the proliferation issue, but we get bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq and are unable to stabilize the situation. And it costs us credibility. And at some point, I think both the Iranians and the North Koreans decided Americans don't have the wherewithal anymore to use military force over our WMD programs. And both North Korea and Iran walk out of those agreements and were never able to get them back. So the failure to stabilize Iraq between 2003 and 2007 not only cost enormously in terms of lives, treasure, and suffering of the United States military, our coalition partners, and especially Iraqis, but it also had the effect, I think, of dissipating the enormous credibility that we had in the wake of our successful military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was a balance of power that favored freedom that was being used to work the proliferation issue. But once we lost that platform and the credibility, we were unable to follow up on the agreements we had with North Korea and Iran.
It almost sounds like Groundhog Day a little bit. I mean, administrations to this day continue to sort of struggle with this balance.
Yep.
You're talking about getting bogged down elsewhere. I mean, the Biden administration has been bogged down with a number of crises elsewhere. Meanwhile, uranium enrichment continues to grow in Iran. North Korea is firing weapons. These countries consistently ask both this administration and the previous administration, ease sanctions and we will back down on our nuclear programs or our weapons programs. I was with former President Trump in Vietnam when he met with the North Korean leader, and they had to walk out halfway through the talks because they weren't getting any further than that sticking point of, if you do not ease sanctions, we will continue to fire our missiles. So what gives? I mean, how are we going to get past this and actually see some real progress?
It's a real question whether there is going to be still an opportunity to get these two countries in the short run to give up their nuclear programs. I think we should maintain that as a national objective, but I think in the short run, we're going to have to work with friends and allies to enhance deterrence and to be able to make it clear to these countries that any use of their weapons of mass destruction, any use of their nuclear weapons against us or against our friends and allies is going to cause enormous damage to them and to threaten their regimes. So I think we are in a deterrence, protection, cooperation with allies kind of mode. What we've tried to do under multiple administrations is say to regimes like North Korea and Iran, you need to make a strategic choice. You can continue to have your pursuit of nuclear weapons, and you will be isolated diplomatically. You will be economically punished. Your people will suffer. Your regimes will suffer. It is not a long-term bet for the stability of your regime or your country. Or you can give up those nuclear programs. We'll give you security assurances. We'll welcome you back in the diplomatic community. We'll give you economic assistance. And we have not been able to make those choices stark enough and credible enough that either of these countries have been willing to make that decision and give up their nuclear weapons programs.
All the
That's
while,
the problem.
yeah, all the while we have a World War II style artillery war in Ukraine where the aggressor is a nuclear armed state. And this is obviously something that is of great concern to the current administration. You have a section called The Great Power Competition in your book where you talk about how relations, ironically, were okay with China and Russia in the early days of the Bush administration, but as their power grew and as America got distracted with some of these wars, as you say, as both Russia and China grew in power, the world grappled with terrorism, America's unipolar moment as the world's sole superpower began to slip away. And here we are. You know, China is the primary threat. Again, this ODNI report today, China was front and center as the chief threat to the United States, to U.S. national security. Was there something we could have done differently? And I actually want to add to that. You actually pose a question, which I'm going to then pose to you in this section, where you say whether there's something that America knows now about Russia and China that it could have or should have known or factored into U.S. policies, and whether over the last 20 years this might have produced a better result. You asked that question in the book. Can you answer it now?
Yeah, I've struggled a lot with that one, and we can spend a lot of time on it. Let's take China. One thing I'd like to say to your point, you know, there is a view out there that, you know, the bandwidth of any administration is very narrow, and they can only do 2 or 3 things at one time. And for the Bush administration is, you guys did Iraq, you did Afghanistan, you did war and terror, and you didn't do anything else. And one of the reasons we put out these 30 of the 39 declassified transition memorandum is to show to the American people that their government, it's not unique to the Bush administration, is at any one time working the full range of issues of national security and foreign policy challenges to our country. That's how we do it. And if you look at that table of contents, we're doing the whole range. So we were working the China-Russia issue in some sense as hard as we were working Iraq, Afghanistan, and the war on terror. But the China we faced was dramatically different than the China we see today. The China we faced was a country that wanted to a benign international environment so it could focus on its own economic development. It wanted to be part of the international system, not disrupt the international system. It wanted a constructive, cooperative relationship with the United States. It was becoming an economic powerhouse. It was not at that point a military powerhouse. Someone, I think Will Inbuden or one of our authors was saying that if you look at the military capability, and Jim Cartwright's here, he can correct me, but they had something like 18 intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach the United States with nuclear warheads. They had no aircraft carriers. They had a brown water navy that was really a coastal fleet, not a blue water navy able to project power. So it was a very different China that we faced, and our strategy was to try to integrate China into the international system so they would be supportive of that system, so that they would not take action contrary to our interests or those of our allies, and would cooperate with us on international problems. And we did a lot of cooperation with them that benefited the country that's talked about in that transition memo. What changed? What changed, I would say, in the end of the day, is the election of Xi Jinping, the designation of him to take over the Communist Party and then to take over the country in 2012. And he had a very different agenda, and I think a lot of people misjudged him. A lot of people thought he was going to be an economic reformer, a political reformer, and it turned out he's a party man. He was going to revive the party, which was in somewhat decline, revise the party, and then use that party to basically discipline the political system and to assert the party into all aspects of Chinese life, including into the economy. And one of the costs of that, of putting political control over economic reform and opening up, is that he's killed the goose that laid the golden egg, and rather than having double-digit economic growth, he's at this point in the low single digits. He had a different view. His view was the West is in decline, America's in terminal decline. This is China's moment to step forward, to take a central place in the international system, and to start using his economic, diplomatic, and military power, quite frankly, to coerce his neighbors and to seek a local, regional hegemony and, quite frankly, coerce the international community. And finally, to both try to change the international system so as to be more favorable to Chinese interests and squeeze out its democratic principles, and then to offer authoritarian state capitalism as an alternative model to political democracy and market economies on the international system. That's a whole different China than we faced in the Bush administration. And it's a function, I think, for those people who think, don't bother to vote in presidential elections because who wins doesn't matter. Well, who runs these countries really matters, and if you don't believe it, just look at China under Xi Jinping and China under Jiang Zemin or Hu Jintao.
So what's your message on China specifically to Jake Sullivan and President Biden? I mean, especially in this atmosphere right now where we've got spy balloon issues and close call confrontations of military planes and obviously concerns about Taiwan's security. What do you tell them? Because the administration insists we still have to keep talking. We still have to try to find areas of cooperation. And I didn't even mention the tech wars that are going on, essentially.
Right. Well, I think actually there's a good news story here, and I think the American people should take some comfort out of it. Look, we were surprised by Hu Jintao, and we were subject to sort of strategic surprise and then sort of strategic panic, and everybody thought, oh my gosh, the Chinese are 10 feet tall. We have to push back against them across the board. And the Trump administration gets a lot of credit for having awakened the American people to the real China challenge, to the different China that we face now today. They were the Paul Revere. They were to sort of say the Chinese are coming. It has fallen to the Biden administration to try to build a bipartisan policy to deal with the China challenge. And I think we've done pretty well as a country. There is the one thing that seems to unite Republicans and Democrats on the Hill is that we've got to have a more vigorous and effective China strategy. And I think the contours of that strategy are beginning to emerge, which are, as the Biden administration has said, we want to invest at home so we're able to compete effectively. We want to bring our friends and allies along with us because individually, we probably don't have the heft anymore to deal with China, but with our friends and allies, we probably do. And then we've got to compete with China and win in those areas that matter for us. That's not a bad framework. Now, the challenges are twofold. One, can you have that competition and not let the competition drive you into confrontation and conflict? Because a war between China and the United States is lose-lose for everybody. And secondly, can you compete on the one hand and still cooperate on issues like pandemics and climate change? And the jury's out. And so far, the Chinese basically have said, if you don't ease up on us in terms of the bilateral issues and the competitive stuff, we're not going to cooperate with you on pandemics and climate change, even though cooperation on those issues is very much in China's own interests.
Absolutely.
So it's a work in progress, but I think the country's done pretty well in awakening to the challenge, developing a policy. Now we've got to resource it. We've got to be consistent. It's got to live past this administration to future administrations, because this is going to be a challenge we're going to be dealing with for a decade.
I want to remind folks who are tuning in virtually, as well as those who joined us, that we are going to be taking questions in a few minutes. I still have Stephen all to myself for just a few more questions, though. I definitely want to touch upon the section of your book that talks about India. Ironically, I was reading it while I was in India with Secretary Blinken, and you talk about the interest in the Bush administration to really build on the relationship with this emerging democracy and the potential that you saw in India for free market democracy and other close cooperation with the U.S. The India I visited last week certainly has grown as a result of that, but it is also changing dramatically. A lot of human rights concerns that it is not completely on the West side with regard to the war in Ukraine, buying Russian oil below the market cap, but still buying Russian oil, for example. And so I'm curious how you saw India's potential then, 20-something years ago, versus now, and whether or not you still see it as a major player, or if you are concerned at all that it's starting to diverge from the vision that you had for it back then.
It's clearly a major player, and it's a different relationship, I think, a result of efforts made by the Clinton administration, Bush administration, Obama administration, all the way through. This is an example, if two lessons come from the book. If one is that your government is doing not just 3 things, but 30 things all at once. Another lesson is that a lot of the initiatives that arise in foreign policy really come from the president. The president is the chief strategist for any administration. Yes, they've got to have Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor to take their direction set by the president and turn it into effective policy. But it's interesting how many, if you read the transition memos, how many of the initiatives of the Bush administration came from the president. And this is one. In the campaign, Bush made very clear that, yes, everybody's focused on the emergence of China, but India is also emerging. And he said India is going to be a global player, and it is in our interest to have India closely linked to the United States when it emerges as a global player, particularly since it is also the world's largest democracy and shares our values and principles. So we used the civil nuclear agreement, which allowed India to, in some sense, to escape from being a non-proliferation pariah and come back into the international community by accepting various non-proliferation constraints. That was basically a symbol to the American people and to the people of India that there was a different relationship with the United States on offer. And it really, I think, went a long way towards moving India towards a strategic partner of the United States. Now, strategic partner does not mean they're going to be in lockstep with us on every issue. And that's true of any great power. It's true with our European allies. We have lots of disputes with them. But I think the India of today is essential, not only because it is a major global player on many issues, but it also is participating in the dealing with the emergence of China. And you see that in the Quad, in which India is participating with Australia, the United States, and Japan, on dealing a net range of challenges, but one of which is China. So it's a work in progress, but I think it was an initiative by the president that has been followed up and has been very much in the interest of the United States.
You had some brief references about Turkey in the book, which also caught my eye. And obviously, any discussion of Turkey has to begin with the fact that they're going through a terrible time right now. And all of our hearts are with them as they try to recover from this terrible earthquake. But You talked about efforts to get Turkey into the EU sphere, and obviously those efforts continue to this day with no light at the end of the tunnel, it seems. But obviously they are also a very key player in NATO. They've also been a little bit of a controversial player in NATO, not least of which because of President Erdogan's efforts to potentially block Finland and Sweden from joining the alliance. Yep. And so I just wanted you to reflect briefly on Turkey and where it's going as far as trying to be this Western type democracy, and whether or not you see that potential for EU candidacy.
The Bush administration's view was that in the same way that Turkey was a member of NATO, it should be a member of the EU. But that's not a decision for us to make. That's a decision the EU has to make. But we were very clear on what we thought was in the interest of long-term stability in Europe. Why? Because a Turkey in NATO and a Turkey in the EU would be anchored in the West. But the Europeans were not willing to go along. And there's blame on both sides in terms of the EU and in Turkey, but the result, when we were dealing with Erdogan, this was what he wanted, was to become a member of the EU. When it was clear that that was not going to happen, he's decided that Turkey would go, in some sense, its own way on foreign policy. And the Turkey we are dealing with today is very different than the Turkey that I dealt with under the Bush 41 administration. Which basically was a firm ally in NATO and didn't have much of a foreign policy outside of that. And Turkey now today is a regional player and playing in an important way in all the issues of the region. And I think it underscores one respect in which the world today is very different than the world we face. We've talked about the return of great power competition, China and Russia. But you've also had the emergence of middle powers that really matter and have weight in the international system. India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Turkey. There's a lot of them. And so it is one of the challenges of the Biden administration and future administrations will be, yes, dealing with great power competition, but dealing with a situation where you have a lot of middle powers that are players and that need to be brought on side. And one of the problems we have with our policy on supporting Ukraine against the invasion of Russia is we've not made the sale in the global south among these middle powers as to our narrative as to how we got into this versus the narrative of the Russians and the Chinese. Mm-hmm. That's a problem, and it's one of the challenges of foreign policy. We've got to be much more attentive to countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and we not have to come to them not only sort of waving our finger and saying, don't get too close to China. We have to have something on offer that competes with what the Chinese are offering that addresses their underlying needs and requirements. We don't have that right now.
Interesting. The book is so rich with content that I am trying to squeeze in at least one more question really quickly so that we can open to the audience. You have an entire section about pandemic preparedness and combating endemic diseases. Obviously the Bush 43 administration did not deal with coronavirus, but you dealt with HIV, AIDS, malaria, other viruses that, tested the interagency process, the preparedness of the administration. And so, what lessons do you communicate in the book to the current situation that we faced, especially in recent years with the pandemic?
Well, one of the things that's interesting, and it goes to this issue about presidents as the chief strategist for administration, the Bush administration got into pandemic preparedness because President Bush read this book that came out on the 1914 or 1916 Spanish flu that killed lots of folks. And he basically went into Fran Townsend, the Homeland Security Advisor, and say, we got to be prepared for something like this because we've seen SARS, we've seen bird flu, it's on the way. So we tried to get a group of people together and put together a plan of preparedness. And I think it's one of the lessons about transitions that was available to subsequent administrations. I think it was underutilized by subsequent administrations. And I'm not sure exactly why, but one of the problems of any new administration is you come through this election, you win the presidency, you're adrenaline is up and you think the world is your oyster and you're writing on a blank sheet of paper. And we're gonna change the world. And I think one of the reasons why you want a careful transition is to basically say to the new team, you think you're writing on a blank sheet of paper, but you're not. There's a lot of history. A lot of that history is going to bite you if you're not careful. But actually, there are some things in that prior history that you can use and you should use. And if you prepare them in such a way that they have bipartisan support and support of both the executive branch and the Congress, you make it easier for a new administration, whatever party, to say, okay, we'll embrace it. And that's one of the things we tried to do with a number of our policies.
Got it. I didn't get to all my questions. Hopefully, there's a great section about climate in the book, so hopefully someone asks. But I'm going to open the floor to questions. I can take one from folks in the room, and I'm going to take one virtual as well. Any of you? I think you raised your hand first, sir, so we'll take your question first. Yes, you. There is a mic over here if you can make it.
I don't need one.
Oh, perfect. But for the virtual audience,
I was in the Marine Corps.
it's helpful for the virtual audience can hear you, sir. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I thought when I'd say Marine Corps, everybody would stand up, but I guess not. Thank you, sir, for taking the time to come to talk to us this afternoon.
Can you introduce yourself? Introduce yourself, sir. Introduce yourself, please.
My name's Ross Duckworth. I'm retired from the United States Marine Corps. You can stand up now. And I'm a defense consultant here in Washington. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us and your candor, which is appreciated. You have given us an excellent, outstanding foreign policy brief and an explanation of the Bush foreign policy, which I think was excellent, although I did not vote for the man. But what I was hoping to hear from you was about this transition, which is outlined in the book you've edited. And it's my understanding this is the most remarkable transition between opposing parties in the United States. And it's just simply commendable. If you would care to comment on that from your personal perspective on how you were involved. And I go back to a quote that I saw, India is our friend, Pakistan is not. Thank you, sir.
So my first transition was from the Ford to the Carter administration. And I was asked to stay on. So I left my office the last day of the Ford administration, and I had lots of filing cabinets full of documents that were the papers I was using to manage the issues on which I was managing, and I expected to come back the next day, the first day of the Carter administration, see lots of staff around, have my documents, go forward sort of uninterrupted. And when I came to work in the first day of the Carter administration, all the documents were gone because they had been trucked away to the Ford Presidential Library. So all the classified filing cabinets were empty, and there was no staff because everyone had been fired, and there were only 3 or 4 of us who were asked to stay on. And my recollection is we didn't prepare any transition memos for the incoming Carter administration. So when Zbigniew Brzezinski showed up for work, he didn't have a staff, he didn't have any documents, he didn't have any memos to tell him what was going on the issues. Now, he filled out his staff very quickly, and as you do, because the NSC staff is not Senate confirmed, but that didn't strike me as good government. President Bush in spring of 2008 said to Josh Bolten, his chief of staff, I want this to be the best transition ever, because the new team is going to face a war in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan, the war on terror, and that was before we knew they were going to face the most serious financial and economic crisis since the Great Depression. And so basically, he wanted it to be the best transition, and President Obama, then President-elect Obama, agreed. And the two teams, the outgoing team and the incoming team, worked together to try to break new ground and how to ensure that the new team was ready to go on day one. The details are in the book. Martha Kumar has an essay at the back of the book that describes all the things we do. A lot of those things have now been enshrined in legislation and sort of set the standard of how future transitions should be done. I think that's one of the things the American people ought to feel good about, that we are actually taking transitions more seriously on a more bipartisan basis, and our institutions have evolved in a positive way.
Outstanding. Thank you.
I could listen to
you.
these stories all day. Will you take another one from the audience here? Yes, sir.
Thank you so much.
To the mic, please. Yes, thank you.
This is Khashayar Junaidian with BBC Persian. I have a question regarding the war in Iraq. It's the 20th anniversary. And back then, when you were preparing for the war, the people in Iran were thinking that they were going to be next. And there was a lot of concern there in Tehran. And later on, with the war, when the war happened, they took the situation for their own advantage, and IRGC expanded its influence in Iraq, and not only Iraq, other countries in the Middle East. Did you see that go this way, and what went wrong?
I think the focus was on a national security challenge that was presented by Iraq. And again, some of that was mistaken because he didn't have the WMD we thought he had. There were consequences that we were going to face, and one of them was going to be what to do about Iran on one side and Syria on the other. And they were a challenge for us. I would say we never really fixed the problem about ingress of terrorists into Iraq through Damascus airport. We made efforts. I think we reduced it, but I don't think we solved that problem. We did, I think, do a pretty good job, and David Petraeus can talk to you about that, of basically saying to the Iranians, you know, if you mess with our folks in Iraq, you're going to pay the consequences. After we left in 2011, the way you saw a shift in Maliki, who was then the prime minister, and it somewhat opened the door for Iran. And then when, because of the policy, in part the policy we pursued on Syria, Al-Qaeda was able to reconstitute itself in ISIS in Syria, and in 2014, I think, come in and take over 40% of Iraqi territory and mitigate and undermine all that we had accomplished with the surge in 2007, 2008. That further opened the door to Iran because it was Iran-backed militias that cooperated with our Iraqi security forces to push ISIS out of Iraq. It's a problem now for the regime. The regime has huge challenges. It's got a terrorism problem. It's got volatility in oil markets. It's got disruptive neighbors in terms of Iran. It's one of the reasons why it is so important that despite the reservations that the Obama administration and the Trump administration and even Biden administration may have about Iraq, we are still there with 2,500 troops training the Iraqis to help them deal with the problem of terrorism, and by our diplomatic and military and economic presence, help the Iraqi government balance against the Iranian influence. That's the situation we are faced with. And the profile we have of sort of a light footprint of enabling local forces to deal with the security challenges is the right one. We've evolved that since the days of the invasion in Iraq, and it's the right model, and I think it's working, and I think it's helping the Iraqi government. It's difficult, it's challenging in Iraq. I described all the challenges that they face, but they are still a democracy that have had 6 peaceful elections and peaceful transitions of power, and I'm hopeful that the aspirations we had initially for Iraq will at some point become to fruition, which is an example in the Middle East of how Sunni, Shia, and Kurds can all work together in a democratic framework to pursue a common future. That would be a good message for the region.
How about Iran's presence?
It's a challenge. It's a challenge for the government. Their real task, which they've not accomplished, is to bring those Iranian-backed militia under the framework of their military force and get them under control. And that's a political challenge that they're going to have to deal with.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to take one from the virtual audience, unnamed person. Oh, nope, it was Dan Fried, sorry.
Yeah.
Ambassador Fried. So he's asking, can we say that the look toward Africa has become more visible from the mandate of Obama to become more important now from the days of the Bush 43 days?
Towards Africa?
Africa.
Well, shout out to Dan Fried, who is actually one of the folks who participated in this book and wrote one of the postscripts. One of the reasons we put out the book was one of the stories that is not understood and known is the Bush administration policy on Africa, which resolved 6 major regional wars on the continent, which were causing enormous loss of life and disruption, that came up with a new model of development that viewed countries as partners, developed local plans for their own development, insisted on accountability and measurable results in development, and then, of course, led an international effort to deal with the problems of HIV/AIDS, malaria, and neglected tropical diseases. So I would say we have a great record, and I think subsequent administrations have carried it on. I'll give you one more story. So
Why does the continent then feel so neglected, though? And then you tell your story.
because I think the continent has been neglected. I think Bush was an exception to the rule. I think the Obama administration carried it forward. I think one of the costs of the Trump administration was they did not have the kind of view towards Africa. And one of the problems for the administration, and you can see it in this administration, you've got China to deal with, you've got Russia going into Ukraine, you've got uncertainties in the Middle East about Iran and about the potential reemergence of tensions between Israelis and Palestinians. They've got a lot of things to do, and I think sometimes Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia don't get the attention they deserve. We've got to change that because China and Russia are very active in those places.
You were going to tell a story, though.
So President Kikwete of Tanzania President Bush visited Africa the last time he visited while he was president, and the election was looming. And someone in the audience asked President Kikwete, with Bush standing right next to him, so how do you feel about the prospect of an African-American being elected president of the United States? And Kikwete's standing right next to President Bush, and he says, well, I think that's great, but of course the American people decide who they're going to elect to president. But if they do, I would tell Senator Obama, then President-elect Obama, he should be as good a friend to Africa as this man standing here has been. That's something the American people should feel good about, because the HIV/AIDS, malaria program, neglected tropical diseases was done on a bipartisan basis between the White House and the Congress, funded by the American people, taxpayer dollars, and it saved tens of millions of people. 25 million HIV/AIDS, another 10 million in terms of malaria. It's a great thing. It shows what to the American people what you can do with American leadership and taxpayer dollars if used in a responsible way. It's a good news story, and the American people don't know enough about it. They should, because it's a real credit to them.
It's an excellent note to end things on, but sadly we do have to end it. Thank you so much, Stephen Hadley. So great to finally meet you and to talk to you. The book is called Hand Off: The Foreign Policy of George W. Bush Passed to Barack Obama. For those who are here, there are copies available outside. Thank you to the Atlantic Council, and have a great day.